Jack Morgan hadn't seen the lake in nearly 12 years. It had been part of his childhood, his teenage summers, and eventually a quiet place he escaped to during the harder years of life. The ranch had belonged to his late uncle, a quiet man, who never married and never left the land he loved. Jack had always admired that about him. When the call came from the family attorney, informing him that the ranch and everything on it now belonged to him, Jack didn't hesitate. Now, with the July sun riding high and the familiar crunch of gravel under his tires, Jack steered his old Ford pickup down the winding dirt road that cut through the hills. The ranch looked just as he remembered, dry golden grass stretching to the horizon, scattered mesquite trees, and the faint shimmer of the lake ahead. The water was his favorite part, hidden behind a slope and ringed with willows. It was quiet, clean, and untouched. He planned to camp for a couple of nights. Nothing fancy, just a small tent, a cooler with some sandwiches, a fishing rod, and maybe a few pages of the old paperback novel tucked into his duffel bag. Jack wasn't looking for anything more than stillness, a break from the constant buzz of town, traffic, and small talk. As he passed the old mailbox at the edge of the property, he slowed. The wooden post was still there, leaning slightly, but now it had a neighbor something new. A clean metal sign had been staked next to the post, bolted onto a short fence panel. It read, "Private access, lake area for community use. Please respect rules." Jack frowned. There had never been a sign there before. And certainly not one suggesting the lake was community anything. This land had been in his family for over 70 years. His uncle had lived on it full-time. There were no neighborhood associations or shared spaces out here, just ranch land, fencing, and long gravel roads leading to nowhere but pasture. He shook it off for a moment. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, a prank even. He drove on. A few hundred yards later, another surprise waited for him. Where the old path led down to the lake, a brand new gate had been installed. Simple metal tubing, painted black with another sign mounted neatly at eye level. This one was more direct. Lake access for Meadow Ridge HOA residents only. Jack turned off the truck engine and stepped out. The sun was bright, but he could feel the edge of a breeze rolling off the water beyond the trees. He walked up to the gate and rested a hand on the warm metal. It wasn't locked, but it was clearly intended to deter entry. He stood there for a few moments, trying to put the pieces together. The Meadow Ridge development was about a mile east of the ranch. Boundary a row of newly built homes with neat driveways and manicured front yards. He'd driven past the sign a few times when visiting years ago. But it never occurred to him that anyone from the development would even know the lake existed, let alone believe they had access to it. He took a breath, stepped back to the truck, and pulled out the property map he kept folded in the glove box. The borders were clear. The lake was entirely within his ranch. No easements, no shared ownership, no pathways running through. Whatever this was, it wasn't official. Jack reached for the toolkit in the back of the truck. He didn't want to cause trouble. But he also didn't come all this way to be turned back by a sign that didn't belong. He gently unlatched the gate and rolled it open. The hinges squeaked, dry and underused. Then he drove through, closed it behind him, and made his way to the lake. The water sparkled, just like he remembered, and for now, it was his again. Jack had barely finished setting up his small tent when the wind picked up slightly, rustling the tall grass and whispering through the trees. The lake shimmered under the afternoon sun, peaceful and familiar, as if it had been waiting for him all these years. He moved slowly, taking in every detail. The willow branches swaying over the water, the splash of a frog in the reeds, the smell of warm earth and dry cedar. But even with all that serenity, he couldn't shake the thought of that gate. He hadn't planned on spending his first evening on the ranch thinking about signs and fences. He had planned on grilled sausages, a good book, and maybe a cold beer as the sun dipped behind the hills. But now his thoughts kept drifting back to the words HOA residents only, like an itch he couldn't ignore. Something about it didn't sit right. After casting his line into the water and letting it sit for a while, Jack gave in to his curiosity. He climbed the slight ridge that overlooked the lake and pulled out his phone. Cell service was weak, but good enough to look up the name, Meadow Ridge Homeowners Association. The search brought up a website filled with photos of pristine lawns, backyard pools, and community guidelines. There was even a digital map showing amenities like a clubhouse, tennis courts, and he blinked Lake Meadow Ridge. He stared at it, dumbfounded. The image showed a narrow dotted trail leading from the development down a hill, directly to his lake. A blue shaded area covered the water labeled Shared Recreation Zone. Jack lowered the phone and looked. Out over the water, there was nothing shared about it. The lake had no trails, no docks, no picnic benches, nothing to suggest it was designed for visitors. His uncle had always kept it natural, the way it had been for decades. This wasn't a public park or a shared pond behind a cul-de-sac. This was deep ranch land, fully enclosed and properly deeded. He walked back to camp with a slow, steady step, thinking it over. That sign at the gate hadn't been a mistake. Someone had taken the liberty to create access that didn't belong to them, and they'd done it with a level of confidence Jack found hard to ignore. Whether it was a misunderstanding or something more intentional, it had led to a physical structure on his land, complete with signs telling him where he could and couldn't go. Just before sunset, Jack lit a small campfire and cooked over the open flame. He sat back on a folding chair with his meal on his lap, watching the sky change color over the water. The golden orange faded into dusky blue as night settled over the hills. Crickets began to chirp, and somewhere across the lake, an owl called once and went silent. He leaned back, letting the calm of the moment take over again. But just as he began to relax, the sound of gravel crunching under tires caught his ear. Jack stood slowly from the far side of the trail. A white SUV appeared, headlights off but unmistakably headed toward the gate, stopped just short of the entrance. 3 figures stepped out, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in business casual clothes that didn't belong in the countryside. One of them, a tall man holding a clipboard, pointed toward the lake and began walking up the trail with a deliberate stride. Jack stayed by the fire, waiting. He wasn't sure what kind of conversation was coming. But one thing was certain. This peaceful weekend had just taken a turn he hadn't expected, and something told him it wasn't going to be the last. Jack remained by the fire as the 3 figures approached, his expression calm but alert. The taller man with the clipboard led the group, walking with a sort of confidence that suggested he was used to people listening to him. The woman followed, closely, speaking in a low tone to the man beside her, both of them casting glances at Jack's tent and the parked truck nearby. "Good evening," the man said as he stopped a few feet from Jack's chair. He didn't offer a smile. "I'm Richard Mallory. I'm the president of the Meadow Ridge Association. Here's Susan, our secretary, and Mark, head of grounds and facilities." Jack nodded politely, but didn't stand. "Jack Morgan. This is my land. Can I help you with something?" Richard glanced around the campsite, then down at the clipboard. "Actually, yes. We had a report that someone was camping near the community lake, and when we arrived, we found this setup. That lake is part of our shared natural area. It's for the use of Meadow Ridge residents only. I'm sure you didn't know." Jack raised an eyebrow, amused but not angry. "I know exactly where I am. This lake's been part of my family's ranch since the 1950s. The deed is still in my name." Susan stepped forward, smiling, but it didn't reach her eyes. "There's been some recent adjustments to the area boundaries. It's possible that your information is out of date. You've had developers working with the county for years on making this lake more accessible." Jack tilted his head slightly. "Adjustments, huh? That's interesting, because I was at the county records office last fall, and there was nothing on file suggesting any part of this ranch wasn't private property." Mark shifted uncomfortably, clearly not enjoying the conversation. Richard, however, held firm. "Well," he said, "there might be some confusion. The gate we installed is there to prevent non-residents from wandering in. It's a safety issue, really. But if you'd like, we can go back to the board and check with our property consultant. In the meantime, I'm going to have to ask you to pack up and head out. Jack finally stood, brushing off his jeans. He wasn't a tall man, but he carried himself like someone who had weathered a lot worse than a clipboard and a polite request. I appreciate you coming out here, he said evenly, but I'm not going anywhere. This land belongs to me. The lake, the trail, even that gate you put in it's all within my boundaries. I've got the paperwork in my truck if you'd like to see it. There was a brief silence as the three exchanged glances. No need, Richard said, his tone cooling. We'll follow up with the county. But just so you know, if you're here tomorrow and we haven't been able to verify your claim, we'll have to escalate this. Jack didn't respond right away. He simply walked over to the fire, grabbed another log, and dropped it into the flames. Sparks jumped into the air. You do what you need to do, he said. I'm not trying to cause problems, but I'm also not moving off my own land. Without another word, the three turned and walked back down the trail. The SUV doors closed one after another, and the vehicle backed away from the gate before disappearing into the trees. Jack stood for a long moment, the firelight flickering across his face. He hadn't expected visitors not here, not now. But if they thought a few signs and a clipboard were going to push him off land his uncle had cared for his entire life, they were in for a surprise. He poked at the fire and sat back down. One thing was becoming clear: this weekend was going to be more eventful than he'd planned. The sun had barely risen when the sound of tires crunching over gravel stirred Jack from a light sleep. The air was still cool, and a faint mist hovered above the lake. He unzipped the tent, squinting toward the trail. A pair of headlights was cutting through the morning fog. Not an SUV this time. A patrol vehicle. Jack stood up slowly, pulling on his flannel shirt and stepping into his boots. The truck rolled to a stop beside the open gate, and two uniformed sheriff's deputies stepped out. They looked around, spotted Jack, and approached with measured steps. Morning, the taller of the two said as he adjusted his belt. You Jack Morgan? I am, Jack replied calmly. Something I can help you with, officers? We got a call early this morning, the deputy said, glancing at a notepad. Said someone was possibly camping without authorization near Meadow Ridge Community Lake. Caller mentioned you may have entered through a restricted area. Jack gave a short laugh, not out of disrespect, but because the situation was becoming more surreal by the hour. Yeah, I figured that call might come, he said. You're standing on Morgan Ranch. Been in my family since before Meadow Ridge was even a sketch on a builder's map. The younger deputy looked toward the lake and then back to the gate. Do you have any paperwork with you? He asked. Jack nodded and walked over to his truck. From the glove box, he pulled out a folder with neatly kept documents, land surveys, a copy of the deed, and a detailed map of the property lines. He handed it over, and the two deputies reviewed it together, flipping through the pages. Mind if we take a walk? The taller deputy asked. Not at all, Jack said. Leading them toward the trail that overlooked the lake, the three men walked in silence for a few moments. Birds chirped from the trees and the water lapped softly at the shore. Jack pointed out the bright orange survey stakes his uncle had installed years ago, still standing. Faded but intact. This lake sits entirely within the property lines, he explained. No easements, no public paths. That gate was put in recently. Not by me. The deputies studied the layout and compared it with a GPS marker on their mobile device. A few minutes passed as they made a call back to dispatch. Finally, the taller one gave a small nod. Looks like you're right, Mr. Morgan. The coordinates line up with your map. Everything checks out. Jack didn't gloat. He just nodded back. I'm not looking to cause trouble. Just trying to spend a weekend on land I grew up on. The younger deputy looked toward the trail again. Mind if we take a picture of the gate and the sign? Might help us file a report in case this comes up again. Be my guest, Jack said, after snapping a few photos and returning the paperwork. The deputies thanked him for his time and apologized for the inconvenience. Sometimes these situations get a little tangled, the older one said, especially when new developments move in. If you have any more issues, feel free to give us a call directly. I appreciate that, Jack replied. As the patrol vehicle drove away, Jack stood alone again under the rising sun. The fire had burned down to embers, and the morning mist was starting to lift. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the battered thermos beside his tent and sat back in his folding chair. The lake was quiet again, but the calm felt temporary. The sign, the gate, the call to the sheriff, it all pointed to something bigger than a simple misunderstanding. Jack took a sip of coffee and stared out over the water. Whatever was coming next, he had a feeling this wasn't over. By the following afternoon, Jack had packed up his camp but wasn't heading home just yet. He'd come to the ranch for peace, but now that peace had been replaced with a growing sense of unzanned curiosity. The gate, the sign, the unexpected visit. And now the sheriff's call-out, it was too much to ignore. He decided to drive into town. The county records office was tucked behind the courthouse, squat brick building with dusty windows and humming fluorescent lights. Jack stepped inside and was greeted by a woman at the front desk who looked up from her crossword puzzle. "Can I help you?" "Yes, ma'am," Jack said with a polite nod. "I'm looking for some information on property records for Morgan Ranch, particularly anything that might involve changes near the lake area in the last year or two." She pointed toward a desk in the corner. "You'll want to talk to Earl. He's the one who handles plat maps and property filings." Made his way over. Earl was a wiry man in a flannel shirt and reading glasses who looked like he'd been doing the job since before computers. Jack explained the situation. A gate had gone up, signs referencing community access, and a claim from the HOA that they had some sort of shared rights to the lake. Earl frowned as he listened. "Let's take a look," Kay muttered, turning to his screen and tapping at the keyboard with 2 fingers for the next 15 minutes. Earl scrolled through digital files, then turned to a set of old map drawers and pulled out a couple of folded plats. He spread them across the desk, comparing shapes, shaded zones, K, and parcel numbers. "Here's the original layout from the 80s, Earl said, pointing to Jack's ranch boundaries, clearly enclosing the lake. "And here's the latest filing, from Meadow Ridge Development, dated about 9 months ago." Jack leaned in. The new filing showed a narrow sliver of land labeled as a recreational access trail, leading from the edge of the Meadow Ridge neighborhood down toward the lake. It extended just far enough to brush the water line in his land. "That doesn't look right," Jack said. "I've never sold off any strip of land, and my uncle wouldn't have either." Earl nodded. "I agree. There's no record of a subdivision or sale involving this parcel. No easement request either. That trail is on your land, at least according to every official file I can find." "Can someone just file something like this and have it go unnoticed?" Jack asked. Earl scratched his chin. "Well, technically, anyone can file a plat map for future development or planning, but it doesn't make it legally binding. It just means it exists in our system until someone can test it." Jack exhaled slowly, trying to keep his voice even. "So if I hadn't come out here, they might have just kept using the lake without anyone realizing it wasn't public." "It's possible," Earl admitted. "Some developers do what they can to add amenities to their listings. Sometimes that gets ahead of actual ownership." Jack straightened up. "Can I get a copy of that map and the filing details?" "Sure thing." Earl printed the documents and handed them over in a thick manila envelope. "If I were you, I'd get a licensed surveyor to confirm your boundaries and maybe talk to a land attorney. Doesn't hurt to make your side official too." Jack nodded. "I appreciate your help." As he walked out of the office, envelope under one arm, he paused on the courthouse steps and looked out over the quiet town square. The situation was starting to take shape. It wasn't just a mix-up or a neighborly disagreement. Someone had drawn lines where they didn't belong and expected no one would question it. But Jack wasn't just anyone. And now that he knew the truth, he intended to set the record straight. The morning after his visit to the county office, Jack was back at the ranch only this time. He wasn't alone. A white pickup with a company logo reading Dalton and Son Surveying was parked just off the main trail. Two men unloaded gear from the truck bed, tripods, measuring equipment, and a drone that buzzed softly as it lifted off and hovered overhead. Jack stood nearby, arms folded, watching as they got to work. He'd hired them the moment he got back into town. If there was one thing he'd learned over the years, it was that facts carried weight and nothing spoke louder than a fresh, verified property survey from a licensed team. Within the hour, bright orange flags and metal stakes were being placed at key points along the property line. Each one marked the legal boundary of his land with GPS precision. One of the surveyors, a younger guy named Leo, walked up with a clipboard. "Your lake's entirely inside your property. All of it," he said confidently. Whoever filed that other map wasn't even close. Jack gave a slight nod. "That's what I figured." Leo looked toward the gate in the distance. "You want us to mark the entrance trail too?" "Yes," Jack said, "and take a few photos while you're at it." He wasn't trying to make trouble, but he was going to make things clear. The next time someone questioned his right to be on his land, he wouldn't just have words, he'd have records, survey markers, and timestamps to back it up. By mid-afternoon, the crew had finished their work and packed up. Jack walked the boundary line on foot, checking each flag and noting where the newly added lake access trail had crossed into his land. Sure enough, the metal gate had been installed nearly 40 feet inside his property line. He took a few photos of it himself, just in case. Then he drove back to the barn, where he kept a stack of old signs in a corner near the tack room. Most were faded from his uncle's time, but one or two were still in good shape. He pulled out a freshly painted one, attached it to a post, and returned to the gate. The new sign read, "Private property, no unauthorized access beyond this point." He installed it right beside the gate, directly beneath the HOA access-only sign. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. As a final step, Jack mounted a trail camera to a nearby tree. It was well hidden and angled to catch anyone passing through the gate, whether on foot, in a vehicle, or dragging a kayak down to the water. That evening, Jack sat on the tailgate of his truck, sipping a bottle of root beer and watching the wind ripple across the lake. The orange survey flags flapped gently along the ridge, and for the first time all week, he felt a sense of control returning. This land had always belonged to his family. His uncle had kept it quiet, simple, and untouched. Jack didn't need a fight, but he wasn't about to let a piece of paper and a few signs rewrite the story of this place as the sky turned soft shades of lavender and gold. He heard the faint rumble of tires again. A silver SUV slowed near the gate. Jack couldn't make out the driver through the glare on the windshield. But the vehicle idled for a moment, then reversed and disappeared back down the trail. He smiled slightly. They'd seen the signs. They'd seen the flags. Maybe that was all it would take. But just in case, Jack had the photos, the survey, the camera, and the facts to back him up, and he wasn't going anywhere. For the next few days, Jack stayed put at the ranch. He didn't say much to anyone. He didn't have to. The bright orange flags lined the property edge like quiet sentinels. The new sign at the gate stood tall. The trail camera blinked silently from its perch, and Jack made sure the battery stayed fresh. The legal documents, survey results, and printed maps stayed in a folder on the passenger seat of his truck, always within reach. Then, on a warm Thursday morning, the visitors returned, but not the ones Jack had expected. The first was a young couple, maybe in their early 30s. With two children in the back of a small SUV, they pulled up near the gate, got out, and stood quietly as Jack walked down the trail from his tent with a coffee mug in hand. "Morning," the man said. He wore a Meadow Ridge baseball cap and looked more curious than confrontational. "Are you the guy who owns the ranch?" "I am," Jack replied, not unkindly. The woman stepped forward. We didn't realize this was private. The HOA told us the lake was part of the neighborhood. They said there was a walking trail that went straight to it." Jack nodded slowly. "I've heard that. I don't blame you. but I can tell you for sure this land is part of Morgan Ranch. It's private property. Always has been." The man frowned. "So we're not supposed to be here at all?" Jack shook his head. "No, sir. I've got full surveys, county records, and even a visit from the sheriff's department to back it up." The woman looked genuinely embarrassed. "We've come down here with our kids a few times to fish. We had no idea." "You're not the first ones," Jack said gently. "I get it. But someone's been handing out the wrong information, and it's causing confusion." The couple apologized, turned around, and left without issue. But that wasn't the only visit by the end of the week. 5 more people, some in groups, some alone, stopped by the gate. A few were just curious. Others were skeptical. One man, in a tucked-in polo and driving a luxury sedan, insisted on seeing whatever proof Jack had. Jack showed him the map, the deed, the survey lines, and even a digital copy of the county plat on his phone. The man left without another word. That night, Jack reviewed the trail camera footage. It showed a few people approaching the gate but stopping short once they saw the new sign or noticed the orange flags. Word was starting to spread, and then came the letter. It was taped to the gate one morning, folded neatly in an envelope with "To property owner" written on the front. Jack opened it beside the fire with a skeptical eye. Inside was a short message on Meadow Ridge letterhead, signed by Richard Mallory. The tone was formal but pointed. It referenced an ongoing boundary dispute and suggested a meeting with the association's legal advisor to avoid unnecessary escalation. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the existing surveys, just a subtle nudge to back down or at least compromise. Jack read the letter twice. Then he folded it, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into his folder with the rest of the documents. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't about to ignore one. Either. That evening, he walked the lake again. The sun cast a golden glow across the water, and the air was still and cool. He paused at the edge of the trail, where the survey marker stood tall, and tapped it gently with his boot. They could send letters. They could ask questions. They could schedule meetings, but one thing remained the same. The land was his. The morning lights spilled gently over the ranch, illuminating the lake's glassy surface. Jack sat on the porch of the old barn, sipping coffee and reflecting on the past week's events. The tension that had lingered like a shadow was finally starting to lift, replaced by a cautious sense of peace. After receiving the letter from Richard Mallory, Jack didn't rush to respond. Instead, he contacted a land attorney he trusted, someone who had helped his family with property matters for years. Together, they reviewed every document, survey, and record Jack had collected. Within days, Jack received an invitation from the Meadow Ridge Association to meet and discuss the situation face to face. The tone of the letter was professional, and the invitation emphasized a desire to find common ground and respect for all parties involved. Jack accepted. The meeting took place in a modest conference room at the community center. Around the table sat Richard Mallory, Susan, Mark, and the association's legal advisor, composed woman named Ms. Barrett. Jack arrived with his attorney and the folder of evidence that clearly showed the ranch's boundaries. Richard opened the discussion with a polite acknowledgement that things had gotten a bit tangled. He admitted the association had relied on outdated or incomplete maps and that the gate installation had been premature. "We certainly didn't mean to infringe on your property," Richard said. "Our goal was always to maintain safety and access for Meadow Ridge residents, but we clearly overlooked some critical details." Ms. Barrett spoke next, confirming that the association would retract the access trail designation on their maps and remove any signage suggesting shared use of the lake. "We want to prevent any further confusion or inconvenience," she said, "and we're prepared to update all records accordingly." Jack's attorney then proposed a solution, a formal boundary agreement to be recorded with the county, making the property lines indisputable for all parties. The agreement would include provisions to ensure the association's members understood and respected the limits of the private land. After some discussion, everyone agreed. The meeting ended with handshakes and a new level of mutual respect. Over. The following weeks, the association removed their signs and gate, replacing it with a simple private property marker that aligned with Jack's boundaries. Meadow Ridge residents were notified about the change, and the association's website was updated to clarify the situation. Jack visited the lake one last time before packing up for the season. The water shimmered in the afternoon sun, surrounded by the orange flags that still stood proudly along the edge of his property. He felt a quiet satisfaction knowing the land was protected not just by documents or signs, but by clear understanding that as he turned to leave, Jack caught sight of a family walking along the community trail several hundred yards away, smiling and waving politely from a respectful distance. No gate, no confrontation, just neighbors who knew where the line was drawn. Jack smiled to himself. This was how it was meant to be. The ranch, the lake, the land his family had cared for over generations, all intact, respected, and at peace.